Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our Socially Democratic community for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show. And when you sign up as a campaign organiser, you get access to our premium episodes and a free ticket to a live show. Plus, you get the Haters Hate and the Rest Vote Labour merch. And when you sign up, please check your inboxes for an email from our producer asking for your shipping address so we can send you your swag. Today's episode is also presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people that want to build power to make the world a better place. We develop community engagement strategies to help campaigns win both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall Gantz framework of leadership, organising and action. If you want to create change in your community in 2024, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those who can afford it. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years, and they've helped more than 500,000 people get the compensation they deserve. And if you've been injured at work or on the road, you may have a claim through your superannuation. So for all the expert and empathetic legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And today we're going back to, well, actually, I'll say we're going back overseas. We've been overseas the whole time. But I'm back home, but we're going over to Ireland to talk to David Kitching about the upcoming Irish general elections, which are on Friday the 29th of November. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And also, remember to follow Socially Democratic on all of our social media platforms, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to send out some congratulations to an old colleague of mine in my days of when I lived in South Australia in Adelaide. Over the weekend, there was a by-election in the South Australian State Parliament for the seat of Black that was formerly held by the Liberal opposition leader, but Labor has picked that up. And Alex Dighton has been elected for the Labor Party to represent the community in Black. I first met Alex when I was a union organiser for the TWU, and he was the training officer for the South Australian branch of the SDA. When he finished up there, he went on to become a school teacher and the deputy principal at Sacred Heart. And just wanted to congratulate both the ALP and Alex and Peter Malinauskas. Alex is a wonderful human being, and he ran in the last state election, didn't win, and then he's had another crack and has got elected, and he'll make a great contribution to the Malinauskas Labor government in South Australia. So well done to Alex Dighton. There's another election. We've been doing nothing but elections on Socially Democratic over the last month or so, and another one has literally sprung up in a part of the world that is very much steeped in my own heritage, and it is the Irish general election. And to help me unpack this campaign, this very short campaign, is someone who is familiar to you, who's been on the show before. He's the International Secretary for the Labor Party in Ireland. He works in advocacy and public affairs at Bassline Strategies. David Kitching, Fulcher, Aresh, and good to see you again.
You too. It's been a while. Good to talk to you.
It has indeed. So voters in the Irish Republic will head to the polls again on the 29th of November. That's a Friday, after the 33rd Dáil Éireann was dissolved. And before we sort of throw to you, David, and start to get your own insights into the whole campaign, just for those listeners outside of the Republic that aren't too familiar with Irish politics, the state of play is that there are 174 Teachta Dála or TDs as they're known, or MPs in English, members in the Oireachteas, which is the lower house in the Dáil. So 88 is the magic number to form government. The lower house is made up of 43 multi-member constituencies across the 26 counties in the Republic. At the last election, the seat makeup was this: Fianna Fáil, which I guess it would be a centre-right party, and I guess we'll probably maybe even talk about how you can't sort of replicate traditional Western political left and right politics in Irish politics, because obviously a lot of it goes back to the formation of the country and the anti-treaty forces. But anyway, maybe David can talk a bit more about that in a moment. But Fianna Fáil made up 38 seats, which is 22% of the vote. Sinn Féin got 37 seats with 24% of the vote. Fine Gael, which is also a centre-right party, but more sort of city-based, got 35 seats with 20.9% of the vote. The Greens got 12 seats with 7.1%. Our party, the Labour Party, got 6 seats with 4.4%, and the Social Democrats, yes, there is another centre-left party in Ireland. They also got 6 seats, but only with 2.6%, and there's a whole bunch of other little parties as well that picked up a whole heap of seats. But they're sort of the bigger players. A government that was a coalition government, which was Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and the Greens, of all people. That doesn't make sense to me, but I'm sure we'll find out more about that. And the second thing to note that in 2023, the Dáil voted to increase the size of the Oireachteas from 160 TDs to 174. So this is actually a larger parliament that they're going to be electing at this election. To you, first of all, David, I've done too much talking here. This is a 3-week campaign. This is really quick. Is this quick for Irish politics or Irish political campaigning?
So it's a 3-week short campaign, but they've been campaigning for months, and basically everybody knew that there was an election pending. Even by law, there had to be an election at the latest in February of next year, and then it was within the Taoiseach's gift to decide what the date would be. And ultimately, from the government's point of view, they wanted to get the budget out of the way and some of the packages around that, to be able to stand over certain things. So some of the sweeteners that came in the budget just begin to kick in the next couple of weeks. And there's a rule as to how short or long campaign can be, and they went for the shorter version of it. But the reality is everybody's been out in the doorsteps for months. We had local and European elections in June, and people have been campaigning continuously before that and since.
I guess the order I want to ask this question is, I don't know if I want to go to issues first or actually get to the point about something that we're learning in 2024, which is it is a terrible year for incumbent governments to seek re-election. And the stat that sort of I didn't know until the US election that no incumbent government in 2024 in a Liberal Democratic election has been returned. So this is a big ask for Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Greens. But what is the broad sense of where do folks think this election is going to go, or is it still very much up in the air?
Yeah, you would have been forgiven for thinking, if you're asked 6 months, 12 months ago, for thinking that it would be the same here, that the tide was going out on the government. But that seems to have rolled back somewhat, and at least if polling is anything to go by. And I guess there are a few things at play here. Fine Gael changed their leader some months ago, and their fortunes have revived quite a lot in the intervening months. Leo Varadkar stepped down and Simon Harris stepped in. He's a young guy. He's I think 38 or something like that. And he has been going around like a Duracell bunny. Their tagline around him is a new energy, and basically I think all of his staff are going to die of exhaustion by the time this election arrives. He is a very energetic guy, and he seems to have captured something to a degree in the electorate. So he's revived. There's been that kind of Harris hop, as they've been calling it. So that has changed things somewhat on that side of the dial. I still think, and we'll go through this, I guess, as the conversation goes on, but there is some capacity for slippage there. I think that was a soft bounce that they've had, but it still looks increasingly likely that some formation of the present government, at least with the two larger parties, will probably return, because the other side of the coin is Sinn Féin's performance. 6 to 12 months ago, if you'd asked, they were soaring in the polls. I think they were up on 35% in polling at one point, and they're rivaling the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's combined vote. They have also slipped back very considerably, and the decline looked inexorable for a while, and they seem to have arrested it and maybe steadied the ship a little bit in the last week or two, which is obviously good timing for them. But it's really unlikely that they'll go back to the level of polling that we would have seen last year. And it's sort of looking like they're as far from government as they ever were.
I was going to ask you this later, but let's dive into that now.
Yeah.
I was over in Dublin, 2022. I'm thinking, I can't remember now.
I think so, yeah.
But when I was there, this is what everyone was telling me, including yourself, that that the feeling on the ground was that a whole bunch of voters were fed up with this Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, centre-right coalition of government that had been basically running the country since the Republic was founded. That in the last election, a lot of folks voted Sinn Féin for a whole bunch of different reasons. And we saw that this was their biggest result that they ever had to the numbers I'd mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
And in the summer of 2022, that the feeling is that a lot of people, like more people, were like, you know what, they got close last time, and this time I'm actually going to vote Sinn Féin. And just because I want to give these guys a crack. And look, they may stuff it up, but I'm willing to see what happens because I just want something different. And that was certainly being reflected to the point you said before in the polls. Like one of the highest polls, I think the Irish Independent had them at 37%.
Yeah.
So there was this, and even just seeing their comms, seeing the things that Mary Lou McDonald was saying, the leader of Sinn Féin, they were putting a lot of pressure on the government. They were driving the agenda, particularly around housing. They looked like the opposition in waiting. And then when I went back, just as we're getting ready for this episode, and I checked the polls, it's a 19% collapse in their vote, if we're to believe the polls. Like it is fallen off a cliff. I was going to make the joke that a good friend of mine, Ben Hubbard's over there helping Sinn Féin, and maybe it's happened at the same time as he started working for him. I don't know, but I'm only joking, Ben. But it's like, what, David? What has happened? Like, where has this collapse in the vote come from?
Yeah, it's they're in a very peculiar position. You alluded to the unusual system we have in Ireland, where not all the parties reflect the traditional centre-left, centre-right, and left-right divides more broadly. If you're to compare the parties with their European counterparts, like Fine Gael is your normal kind of Christian Democrat party. Labour clearly has corresponding social democratic parties throughout Europe. The Greens do as well. Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin both come across more like maybe post-colonial liberation movement parties. They have a different background and characteristic, and in both instances, it kind of lends itself to a populist appeal as well. So to come back to your question on Sinn Féin in terms of what's happening, that also brings with it a really uncomfortable coalition of voters at times, especially when they're insurgent. So Fianna Fáil is a party of the establishment. Up until the 90s, they were in government 4 out of every 5 years since the foundation of the state. So they were the state, they were the establishment. Sinn Féin, as an insurgent party, had one TD at the beginning of this century, and working their way gradually ratcheting up, and it was a long view of history, and they did it quite effectively, but it brought with it an uncomfortable coalition internally. So if you went back even 10 years ago, the voter profile of Sinn Féin before this recent explosion of support for them, the voter profile was people who had the lowest levels of trust in politics. Elsewhere in Europe, that voter went to the far right in many instances. So the Front National and Rassemblement National in France and FPO in Austria and so forth. Sinn Féin, to their credit, didn't indulge that as a way of being. So they didn't go for anti-immigrant sentiment or that kind of populist backlash. They went for kind of a left populism. But the problem is that brought with it a combination of voters of the left and those who are more maybe nativist, maybe more aggressive nationalist kind of orientation. And in recent years, we've had this kind of surge in far right activity in Ireland, and Sinn Féin were really caught on the hop on that. Their handling of that as a political phenomenon, it was clearly difficult for them because they're aware of their own voter profiles, and they blinked. So where they'd held the line, they'd held a broadly progressive orientation in terms of not indulging anti-immigrant sentiment or anything like that. They've now triangulated towards the right, and that's brought with it a lower level of trust in them as a party. So first of all, the younger, more progressive urban voters who had kind of become part of their support base in recent years, which is always a soft support base that moves around the system here. Labour had them for a while, and then went into government and lost them. So that support base becomes very uncomfortable once you start developing a more reactionary positioning on immigration, or they change their position in regards to hate speech legislation as well. All of what the far right tends to call kind of pejoratively woke issues. Sinn Féin has been shifting its position on that, having benefited from a broadly socially liberal orientation alongside left economics. Weirdly, it's also diminished their trust on the right, even as they moved right. So I've been working on a project recently for a think tank called Task, where we've been analysing how the mainstream parties have responded to the far right. And as part of that, a colleague of mine did a piece of research on young men who have far right leanings, and did kind of in-depth ethnographic research there. Weirdly, their levels of trust for Sinn Féin has diminished as they've moved to the right because they don't believe it. Yeah, so they've lost on both angles, on both sides. They're not trusted as much amongst progressive voters, nor are they trusted amongst more nationalist voters. Now, they still have a very substantial portion of the electorate, and they're still going to have a strong election, but it's not going to be as strong as it would have expected a year ago. And as well as that, Mary Lou McDonald herself, Sinn Féin themselves have complained that a lot of people who are going to protests and of a kind of more far right nature, they're treating Sinn Féin like they're already in government. So it's this weird dynamic where the closer they got to power, the more they become perceived like and treated like an incumbent government in their own right, even though they're not. So they're getting the flack without the benefit of government, basically.
It's as if they made their run too soon. If they needed that bounce, maybe 12 months out, not 2 or 3 years out.
Yeah, I'll get myself in trouble here, but I sort of compare it to Irish rugby in a way, like where we've been number one in the world several times, but always out of competition, and Sinn Féin seem to have the same affliction in political terms,
They can't get past the quarters.
Yeah.
Let's do a bit of an overview before we dive into some of the parties in particular. But just sort of give us a sense, because you started to talk about some of the issues that would shape this election. The one I'm interested in, first of all, is I want to get your sense of. You talked about immigration because my Twitter feed a couple of months ago was blowing up
Yeah.
certainly what the section of my Twitter feed, which I'd call Irish Twitter, was
Hmm.
blowing up over immigration, particularly on the streets of Dublin.
Yeah.
Just give us some context to how that debate first begun, and how do you think that's going to impact the election?
Yeah. It's so in terms of how it began, well, there'll be various theories on that. So I prefer to take the medium to longer term view as to how we ended up where we are. There's a more simplistic analysis that the Ukraine it started with the Ukraine war, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the arrival of people who provided protection from Ukraine to here, and the pressures that brought. But in reality, Ireland has sleepwalked its way into this scenario where a far right cohort can take advantage of a particular situation. I think for a long time we maybe congratulated ourselves for not having a significant far right political force in Ireland. That Ireland was somehow exceptional or special in these terms, but they said that about Spain, they said that about Finland, and both countries have significant far right forces now.
Mm.
Ireland always had the fundamentals there to allow for this to happen. We were just protected by our electoral system, the single transferable vote system, which encourages very localized politics. So you have to build up your own profile, and you can't just have a charismatic leader bring a load of other TDs over the line. And by the position of Sinn Féin, because like I was saying earlier, Sinn Féin did absorb some of that vote, but didn't act on it in a reactionary far right way during those years, um, and that acted as a protective mechanism. But with Sinn Féin increasing in popularity and support, they became viewed more as a mainstream party. And when they blinked, ultimately that protection is now heavily diminished. And they've altered their positioning quite substantially in certain instances in terms of the welfare provisions for people from Ukraine here, and in terms of maybe a more hard nosed law and order kind of orientation towards people seeking international protection. Um, so yeah, there's a longer history to that doesn't get adequate coverage here, to my mind. But obviously, the increase in the number of people coming here coincides with this surge. And the thing is, in the past, my previous work, I did a lot of research on the far right comparatively throughout Europe. And what you find is that it's never just something like immigration that causes an increase in support for the far right, and it's never just an increase in social or economic need. But when the two combine together, it creates quite a potent combination. So, in 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 the Irish case, it's housing and cost of living. Um, our financial crisis, kind of 2008, and thereafter, was very very linked to housing, and the housing market is an absolute mess, and it's really hard to find places to rent, let alone to buy, and the affordability is just beyond a lot of people. That coincides at a time when there are more people seeking accommodation and services, and the two combined has been played on by the far right, very cynically. And then you get to a point where some of the mainstream parties have a choice whether they oppose the far right, or whether they appease them, or whether they endorse their positions. Maybe not explicitly, but doing so in other ways. Um, so it's become a live issue in a way that it never had been before, at least not to this degree. And that probably reaches zenith around the European local elections, where while you have a few councillors got elected, and there's a decent performance for some of the MEPs, MEP candidates who would be of that orientation, and one of them did get elected. Um, the, the I suppose the real impact has been how they affect the behaviour of other parties. Now it's subsided a little bit for this election. Even in the polling that you see across the various polling companies and newspapers, it has subsided as an issue. It had reached kind of number one or two by the local and European elections. It's down the league table a little bit again now, but it's still there, and it's still served as a mobilising catalyst for far right actors. And I guess their marker of success is not necessarily the same as other parties. I would always say, it's not just about the bums on seats that they get in your councils or in your parliament. It's also how they affect the way other parties behave. And that's been something notable, especially in how the three main parties have been behaving. I know we've discussed Sinn Féin mainly, but they have affected behaviour in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael also.
Well, let's go there, David. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
interested to get a sense of what has been the response from those two major centre-right parties.
So Fine Gael, it's been interesting in the sense that obviously they changed leader, and during the middle part of Leo Varadkar's leadership, they had stood pretty firm in terms of a more open humanitarian or progressive positioning. And for the most part had been quite generous in their orientation. That began to slip towards the end of his leadership, where you'd hear comments about you know, about people maybe cheating the system, or you get these kind of dog whistles that began to emerge. And then Simon Harris took over as leader, and he basically he went about a lot of kind of signals of change. So there have been these issues around people sleeping in tents in the centre of Dublin, and he made a big show of having a clear up of that, and of vocalizing harsher positions. Now a lot of it was a shift in rhetoric as well, but it signaled a kind of shift to the right on Fine Gael's part. Now they framed it as a back to basics, core values kind of thing as a centre right party. Like Simon Harris himself, a lot of his reputation was built on, I guess, a more liberal orientation when he was Minister for Health when Ireland repealed the Eighth Amendment, which restricted access to abortion. So, I guess what's maybe frustrating to watch is that I'm not sure what he actually believes, but he's very effective at taking a position that is politically expedient. And it's paid off for them to a degree. They would argue that it's nullified the issue in political terms. That's why it's fallen down the league table as issues go. But it sort of leaves a dirty taste in the mouth, because ultimately you have people coming here who are leaving just the most horrible of situations, and they're it's giving legitimacy to a dismissive orientation towards what they've gone through and what they actually need to be able to get back on their feet again. Fianna Fáil has been internally divided. Oh yes, one other thing with Fine Gael, there is an internal generational divide there too. A couple of outgoing TDs who are very long-standing veterans in the party, they outwardly called for a shift away from social liberal issues, towards a reassertion of conservative values as well. So that's been there in the background. Whereas I think some of their younger representatives were probably of a more progressive mindset, even within the context of a centre right party. Within Fianna Fáil, there have been a few councillors in particular areas who have come out with some pretty harrowing statements, and like quite nativist in orientation. Now, a number of them were suspended or expelled from the party, but there is that effort to have a more a populist and conservative orientation there too. It's just displayed somewhat differently. Micheál Martin has a different style of leadership as well. He's an older man than Simon Harris. He's been around more blocks than he has. So Fianna Fáil internally, they've had some more aggressive kind of language, uh, but that hasn't been at the leadership level. There'll be a couple of exceptions. I'd say during the European elections, their candidate for Midlands North and West, Lisa Chambers, who had also staked her reputation as kind of a liberal wing of that party and a more progressive. So she had been a very strong campaigner again on repealing the Eighth Amendment, and was seen as this kind of new generation of Fianna Fáiler when Micheál Martin is trying to reorient them, for the times that are in it. She also had a very well signaled shift in tone and language. She was using kind of terms that would have equated the provision of accommodation with people trying to get rich off the back of off the back of the tourism industries. Like she was pitting people people in whole sectors against people who are arriving here seeking asylum. And again, it kind of left a dirty taste in the mouth, and especially from someone who had who had built a reputation on a particular way of being. Um, and there doesn't seem to be any cohesion within Fianna Fáil on that. Sinn Féin, they're always cohesive, you know, but they have moved in one grouping to the right, and they've kind of reoriented their party and their positioning to one that is perhaps more draconian and more law and order focused. So yeah, that's been a signal shift. And then, like, broadly speaking, the parties in the left and centre left have generally held the line. Um, there's a phrase someone used to me about doubling down on decency, and I know there are probably always people who seek political expedience, but the, in reality, like, there's only so much space in the political spectrum for like Labour and Soc Dems and the Greens. And their voters aren't within that nativist category. They're never going to vote for us anyway.
Mm.
So, so in fairness, those three parties have been pretty solid. Even though Roderick O'Gorman, the Green Party leader, he's been the one who's held the integration brief as minister. Now, I would say that he has been handed such a hospital pass by the other parties. So he's been severely let down by the Minister for Housing and others who just kind of they passed on areas where they should have been responsible to him and let him take the fall. So like there are many failings in terms of how the government has handled this, but I think it would be probably unfair to put it at his door. I think he's doing his
Which
best
is,
in a.
it's not a, I mean, that must be very, very familiar to you as a Labor Party member, because
Oh
that's
yeah,
exactly what they
yeah,
did to when Labor was in the coalition,
yeah,
during the global financial crisis as well. Like, you guys had to carry the can on all the social issues where all the funding was cut in order
yeah,
to balance the books. And it seems like old mate O'Gorman from the Greens is having the same experience, hey,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
being in bed with a bunch of basically Irish Tories. Hey, I want to ask you about the elephant in the room in terms of issues is the economy, because we've just come
yeah,
off the back of a US election and we've all been reminded that the number one issue for voters in elections is, their own economic outlook,
yeah,
and how they're going to balance their household budgets. And obviously, globally, the cost of living is an issue everywhere, and it's kicking governments in the arse if they're not seen to be addressing it. And I just want to get a sense from you about, is this also the same feeling that we're having that we just saw in the United States, in Ireland as well, in terms of cost of living, and are voters angry at the current government about what is happening in their own household budgets?
yeah. It's funny, when you frame it that way about the U.S. elections. There is a crossover there where the economy is doing well in headline terms. If you look at GDP or any other of those key indicators, but it doesn't feel like it. Within households, people focus on the very personal when it comes to the economy rather than how stock market is doing or whatever the case may be, or what the corporate tax intake is. So there is that kind of dichotomy where people see the rip roaring success of the corporate tax intake and how the country is seemingly awash with money, but people find it hard to live day to day, and to pay their bills, whether it's energy or like childcare is ridiculously expensive here. It's really hard. Like rents are really high. It's difficult to get a house. If you do manage to find one, it's difficult to get a mortgage that will cover it. All of those things are really keenly to the fore in people's minds. And then there's also the issue of services. And this is where I suppose how you focus the way you manage an economy. Like services were really weakened during the post-crash years. So access to social care, to health services, all of that. They're really underfunded, and there's a sense in which Ireland, has a lot of private wealth, but is the public sphere is poor. So that comes into people's calculations as to how they view, their voting intentions and everything like that. I guess where Ireland might book the trend now, there are no guarantees. There's still 2 weeks to go. So people looked like they were going towards Sinn Féin, like you said before. Give them a go anyway. See how they get on. I guess their handling of their own campaigning and the proposals that they make has probably spooked a number of people. So say for instance, they had built a lot of their growth on the back of the work of their housing spokesperson, Owen O'Brien. He's a very knowledgeable guy, and he knew what he was talking about. And he often set the agenda as to how the rest of the system talked about housing. But then it kind of blinked on this too, where it was notable. They came out and they had a proposal for affordable housing, and said that no house should cost more than €300,000. Now that it was noteworthy at the time that wasn't Owen O'Brien who made that announcement. It was Mairead MacDonald. So I'm not sure if it's something that he would have stood over, because what that did, like a lot of the new middle class voters who were leaning towards them, all of a sudden got spooked, especially those who already did actually own a place, because that would cut the value of any house that was in Dublin, for instance. And it just also didn't sound credible. And they undermined their credibility on that basis. Like your average Fine Gael voter will probably view things through the prism of how the headline economy is doing, so they'll be okay on that. And Fianna Fáilers tend to be good on the ground game. So the interplay of the economy with people's pocketbook, it's you do see some similarities with how things are in the US, but also our electoral system is multi-seat and single transferable vote, so you don't have the kind of stark black and white contrast with the first past the post system. So it would play out differently. Now, the other element that we haven't discussed yet is the position of the independent candidates within the Irish system. So, as you said, incumbent governments across the world are falling, and there's a sense in which our political systems reward not being in government, and that's really true in Ireland's case. But it's again this kind of localistic tendency playing out with that as well. So our system rewards people who've never gone into government or never made a hard decision about anything. So you got these independent candidates doing well all over the place. Now, historically, they were amorphous. They kind of went across the spectrum politically. You get these kind of left independents who would, who would split from the Labour Party or whoever else. And you get a few kind of local populists or centrists. There is an increasing number of them tacking to the right, because it's far easier to move all over the system if you don't have a party apparatus around you. So there is an emergence of a more right-wing tendency amongst independents who are playing on a lot of the issues that we talked about earlier. And if there's any a hard right element in the Dáil at the end of this, they may well end up in those seats rather than with a clearly defined party. It'll be those kind of voices. And they'll be playing off issues like the economy and how it interacts with social concerns or urban-rural divide or whatever the case may be as well. So to go back to your initial question, yeah, the economy will still play a key role. The question is whether people want to change anything with it. Like, one thing you notice with the campaign is it's been pretty apathetic so far. You know, it doesn't really feel like it's taken off properly. You know, like I said, maybe it's just that they have been campaigning for months, even though it's a short campaign now. I think they're all a bit exhausted and just want to get it over with as well.
Mm.
Um, but that and so they may well end up kind of regressing to the mean. So the devil, so Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael might get somewhere towards a majority on their own. They will, but probably not. Probably not just the two of them. They'll require a third or fourth party. Um, but yeah, I think maybe people are going with the more kind of a safe option as they see it.
That's interesting. One thing that I watched the leaders debate that was on RTE
Yeah,
during the week with is it Katie
Katie Hannon.
Hanlon or yeah Hannon.
Yeah,
Um, and I mean, we could do a whole episode just on that debate. So many reflections from that. One, there was like 10 people on the stage. It was ridiculous. It's just such
yeah,
a. And I understand that that's the nature of the Irish political system, but it was. You saw all. I mean, in some ways, it's a beautiful thing about democracy, but you also saw the frailties of a democracy where you have about 50 people on the stage because there were very, very polished politicians on there like Micheál Martin and obviously
yeah,
Simon Harris. I thought Ivana from the Labour Party did a fantastic job, all the way through to the guy from the People Before Profits, who just looked like an angry, um, uh, dad turning up to a parent-teacher interview and is pissed off about having to be there. He had like a quarter zip jumper. He had his arms folded the whole time, and he basically had two talking points that he just wanted to run the whole time. And that party gets 5 seats. It's bizarre.
yeah,
So anyway, and part of it also looked like just a really pissant council meeting, as local council meeting. So anyway, but one thing at the end when all 10 leaders had to give their final pitch, so I think they got like 30 seconds or a minute or something,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that was telling because all of the what I'd call left of the center pitches were talking about, I'm going to do more on our party's going to do more on healthcare and childcare and disability services, housing and climate. And then the centre right parties were talking about those things as well, but also through service delivery, which is a sort of, I guess, a
mm-hmm.
little bit of a right wing framework, maybe. But I thought it was interesting how they, particularly Micheál Martin, talked about it in that perspective. But also then added in the cost of living. Now, what I thought was interesting was Ivana Bacik's Bacik. She spoke about wages and job creation and
Yeah,
education, and got even more specific and said we need to pay our teachers and our nurses better. And I was like, okay, this is some more
yeah,
tangible
yeah,
stuff. Because one of my takeaways I got certainly from the US election was it was too vibe oriented in terms of the pitch to the electorate.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
too values slogany and not enough getting down to what a friend of mine, John Armitage, a political researcher in Australia, would call what are the meaningful benefits that you are offering to the voter. And I thought Ivana's, and I know this is a Labor podcast and we're biased, but I genuinely thought Ivana's pitch towards the end and her performance in the debate was, I'd put them in the top 2 or 3 up with the rest. And I wanted to get your reflections on just some of those things that you got from the debate.
yeah.
During the debate.
I'm happy to hear you picked up on that in particular. Um, there's a real bugbear I have now. It goes back to the country being awash with cash, that basically everybody's wanting to spend it because there's an election coming. And there's a kind of a lazy analysis in certain media circles in Ireland that all parties here are somewhat social democratic now, which is utter shite, to be honest.
Mm.
It's this kind of misunderstanding of what our values are, that just throwing cash at something whether whether it's cleverly spent or not, or whether it has an ongoing social impact or not, that equates to social democracy, which really really annoys me. Um, Ultimately, where Ivana was coming at this from, and she's really consistent in this, is that your spending needs to be is structural. You're looking at structural change. You're not just looking at throwing cash at people or at a specific issue in the long term. And because we've seen this, like, across generations, like when we had the Celtic Tiger era, so the first time where Ireland was genuinely wealthy, and what do we have at the end of it? Like, how well established were our social services at the end of it? We had a couple of tram lines in Dublin that didn't connect, and there obviously there were gains in education in particular, and some other areas, but nothing on the scale that was where the potential was. And this is where Ivan is getting back to, because every time there's an issue, the present government will want to throw money at it. Like, I've done a lot of work in the health sector. I was working with a heart charity a few years ago on this particular project, and the one line that always scared me when I heard it from the Minister for Health, your namesake, was money is not an issue. Money is not an issue is a terrifying thing in Irish public policy, because there's some other issue then. Because if it's not happening and money's not an issue, there's some other reason, and that is usually structural. So in pieces I was working on, money was not an issue, but they didn't have the people to fulfill it. They didn't have the staff within the hospitals to fulfill what we were campaigning for. And that was a much more ongoing structural issue. It required interventions in education, in further and higher education, and then within the hospitals themselves, and to pay them and to have them to have them in secure employment, and plan for the pensions and all of that comes ahead. We have this awful short termism now, where, partially because of the crash, even though the crash was not linked to the management of public finances, it was linked to the private sector. They're still terrified of increasing the staff complement in the public sector, because they'll have to pay the pensions and we're all living longer and all of that. Ivana is coming in on the core structural issues, that we're not putting the people to deliver this in place in the right places. And it's such a vicious circle then as well, because, like, it's really hard to find teachers and nurses to fill the schools and hospitals in Dublin, because Dublin's too expensive. And, like, the teachers and nurses, they used to be decent wages here. You could live a comfortable middle class life off the back of that.
Mm.
Now you can't, especially if you're just entering those professions now. So yeah, it's this kind of planning for educating people in the right things, having the proper, like, not just the infrastructure but social infrastructure as well. So, like, childcare is a hugely important issue here. And just trying to get a place in a creche is tough enough, and then you're basically paying a second mortgage or a second monthly rent on it, in terms of how much it costs. So yeah, this is the thing. Like, throwing money at things is not enough. You need to plan how you do it and do it strategically. And this is something Ivana's been really consistent on. She's come to this proper socialist ethos of having structural interventions, not just throwing money at a wall.
Well, to your point earlier, I mean, I do think that is, I think that is the definition of what a good social democratic government does, is to look at the economy and consider where do we want it to go long term and even medium term, and then therefore how do we reallocate the government purse strings to support the development of that. And to the point that my second point from what I picked up from the debate, which I thought was interesting, was there was no talk about infrastructure spending. And you mentioned the first point, which is social infrastructure spending, but actual genuine infrastructure spending. What struck me about visiting places like Dublin and Cork and Galway, there is a need. Your freeways are shit.
Yeah.
And he just said you're still living off the fact that you built the Lewis about 15 years ago and you still think it's grand and all this stuff, but it doesn't connect with any of your other public transport. You've obviously got those outer suburbs of Dublin that are actually not even in Dublin County, but are in the surrounding counties around Dublin.
Mhm.
These growth corridors, and you've got that ring road, and that's about it. And people are struggling to get into work that work in the city. Like there's a lot of things in terms of public transport, more schools, more hospitals, all of that kind of stuff. If you've
Yeah.
got cash, then you should be throwing it into that because it creates
Yeah.
jobs and it creates good paying jobs, and then everyone's all happy, and then the economy's growing. And I just think that it was really interesting. There's a massive gap in the conversation that no one was talking about that, and it's a great space for Labor to get into because that is
Yeah. Yeah.
our bread and butter, and that is why certainly here in Australia that we continue to win successive elections, certainly to state election level, because that's what we're always talking about.
Yeah, it was peculiar actually that it didn't get a greater mention in last night's debate, because it has come up in other parts of the campaign, but in this sort of strange way. So Fine Gael have, as part of their kind of pitch, they want to establish a dedicated department of infrastructure. Now, I kind of wonder, like on the face of it, I can see some rationale, but I think it's a bit more style than substance. Where you'll just end up having to reallocate resources from other departments, and I don't think they have the correct maybe instincts and or to be honest, historical behavior to give me confidence that they'll deliver effectively because you know, Fine Gael's relationship with fiscal prudence, as they would characterize it, is kind of funny. Like they have, they're very comfortable in terms of saying why something cannot happen or should not happen, and there's always something to stop, an effective change or effective kind of social investment being made. But yet now, but they're happy to continuously throw one-off payments at things and basically waste money. And they are undermining their own kind of image during this election because they've come out with a few real clangers in terms of how in terms of how they want to allocate resources, and they want to change the VAT rate, but for instance, for restaurants and pubs and that kind of thing, forgetting that that would require them to increase the VAT on energy and was going to increase people's cost of living. And so the wheels are a little bit coming off their fiscal prudence type of conservatism. But yeah, and I don't necessarily have confidence in, from an ideological perspective, in how they would deliver on infrastructure, because again, the manner in which they interact with the private sector is a little bit too cap in hand from what I can see. Now, like Labour's proposed, state construction company, obviously a lot of the focus of that was on housing. I understand when things come out in the wash that like the interaction with the private sector will be there some way as well, but Fine Gael have been so utterly developer led in terms of how they've approached this that and the constantly increasing costs on key infrastructure. So the National Children's Hospital, I think it's on triple what it was initially budgeted for. Now it's up to 2 billion. It's going to be the most expensive hospital in the world. By the time it's done, it'll be a nice hospital, no doubt, but there's no value for money in that, and it's been utterly mismanaged, and it's been predominantly under Fine Gael management up until next to Fianna Fáil health minister now, but they allowed that to happen under their watch, and the public interest directors didn't really keep enough keep a close enough eye on that as well. So I just don't necessarily trust their inclinations when it comes to infrastructure. And again, that kind of that kind of tendency to just throw money in the immediate term and not make good use of that, of being awash with cash, is deeply problematic. And it comes back to this thing I was saying earlier of like Ireland being privately wealthy and publicly poor. Like it doesn't look like a wealthy country in many places now, even though we're apparently one of the wealthiest in Europe or even in the world.
Can I want to get your thoughts on just broadly how what the expectations are for the Labor Party going into
Yeah,
this election. As I said at the top of the show, um, the party holds 6 seats.
Mhm.
You may want to give some context about the sort of what are the high watermarks have been in the last sort of decade and a half for the
Yeah, yeah,
parties, just so Aussies can understand that. New Ivana's a new leader. Well, she was a reasonably new leader when I was over there in 2022, and obviously she's been in the job a bit now, but has certainly since when I was there, she's reinvigorating the party
yeah,
off the back of, and you and I did a podcast off talking about it, that this great by-election win in a Melbourne Cup field that no one thought the Labor Party would win, and she came through
yeah.
and surprised everyone, which was fantastic. So, this is her first general election as the leader of the party. And I just want to get a sense of what as a party member and someone on the executive and obviously actively involved in the campaign. How are you feeling? How are the rest of the folks feeling about Labor's expectations? Where are we focusing our energies?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of the watermark, I guess like historically we're often kind of tended to have around 20 seats or so in general, and then we had a couple of high watermarks of one of 35 in the 90s, and then of 37 back in 2011. So that's the highest we'd ever got to, and basically that was followed by a really tough election 5 years later, which brought us down to 7, and went down to 6 again. Ivana brought it back up to 7, and you met Aon O'Riordan before, I think, when you were in Dublin, and
He's a great man.
yeah, and Aon pulled off a great feat in the European elections. He decided to move to the European Parliament, and that was where he wanted to devote his energies. And we ran a campaign which was actually a very fun campaign. He put together a good team, and he got elected. Now it's funny because a lot of the media commentary around the time was that like the best result for Labour would be if Aon like came if he just missed out marginally, so it would just increase the support base while not losing the Dáil seat. I was always of the opinion that I wanted to win the seat, that it's better for us if Aon wins because it's a better story, and also we hadn't had an MEP in the European Parliament for 10 years, so it's time that it's an important body. People disparage it, but it's important that we're there, and he's been doing well over there. And it's interesting now because when you ask about where we're concentrating, so Aon's campaign has, I think, it has had a positive effect on our performance within the Dublin region. In any case, so where it's improved the party brand in that region. So when you look at national polling within our system, like say comparing us to the Social Democrats, they're doing marginally better in national polling, but we're more heavily concentrated in certain ways. So how that plays out will be an interesting one for the psephologists to watch. But he's significantly increased our polling in Dublin, and the candidates themselves on the back of that. So I think that's been a net benefit, even though we've lost a seat from it because we don't have him in the Dáil anymore. So then you're looking at where we have areas of potential growth. So aside from Dublin, a lot of the Labour base has been in recent years has been a few strongholds, or often particular towns where we've had a decently strong base. So, like for example, Alan Kelly in Neenah and Tipperary, Sean Sherlock in Mallow in Cork, Brendan Howell in Wexford Town. So of those, and Jed Nash in Drogheda and Louth, of course. So of those four, only Alan and Jed are running again. So there's a constituency a boundary change, and Sean Sherlock got badly treated in that. Well, not badly treated. They weren't deliberately trying to. They weren't out to get him, but his support base, a lot of it was moved out of his constituency into the neighbouring one, and just the numbers weren't there for him to run again. So Sean decided to step down. Brendan Howland was due to retire anyway, so he's not running again. But in his place, there's a councillor called George Lawler, and George has a huge profile around Wexford. He's a very, very effective councillor. I think we have a decent chance of keeping that seat through George. So there, I think Alan Kelly will keep a seat, and I think Jed Nash will. So first of all, what you have you need to try and hold. Um, it will be difficult to maintain a on seat in Dublin Bay North, but across the other Dublin constituencies, I would be confident for Ivana. I live in her constituency as well, and then Duncan Smith, whom you met before as well. So Duncan in the constituency review, Duncan has been his constituency was split into basically we've 3, 4, and 5 seaters. I think there should be 6 seaters and more as well, but you know, obviously the electoral commission wasn't listening to me. Um, so,
How dare they?
Yeah, so Duncan's the population base in his area grew, so they basically split the constituency and made 2 3-seaters in what was a 1 5-seater before. And 3-seaters are more difficult for small parties to win. But he's been running a really effective campaign, and same Alan's in the 3-seater as well now. But I think they're going to hold on in those cases as well. So then, where can we grow? So within Dublin first, I have a couple of dark horses. So there's a guy called Dara Moriarty in Dublin South Central. Young guy, he's I think only 30 or so. He's got a really good way about him. He's whip smart, but he wears it lightly, which is always a good attribute in a politician. Yeah, he's really down to earth, plain speaking manner, but it gets people. He's friendly. He's well liked, and crucially, he grew up in an area in just near the Coombe in his constituency, where his family had a shop, so like everybody knows him locally as well. So that always helps. Um, I think you'd met Kieran Ahern when you were over as well. I remember when
Hmm.
we went for a beer. Yeah, Kieran's running a really good campaign, and that's in Dublin South, I think. And he's been performing really well. I'd have pretty good feeling about him. And there's a guy called Rob O'Donoghue in Fingal West, so the part that was split away from Duncan's constituency. Rob's a lovely guy. He's funny because he's not like he's fairly understated for a politician, but yet like half of his electoral area seem to owe him or they owe him a favor, and that's also a good position to be in. Then Angela Feeney, I think in Kildare, is a really strong candidate. I don't view her as a dark horse because she's been around longer than these guys. But Angela's a really great candidate, and Mark Wall, she's in Kildare North, and Mark Wall is in Kildare South. I think Mark has a slightly more difficult position in that the Ceann Comhairle, the Speaker of the Dáil, is in that constituency, so that's an automatically excluded seat, so it reduces the space. Did you meet Laura Harman when you were over? I think you did. So Laura, she's a
I
councillor
can't
in
remember if
Cork.
I did or not.
Yeah, she's a councillor in Cork, and she's a really good campaigner. Um, it's funny, some of the pundits are tipping her to win a seat down there, and like she'd be an excellent TD. She kind of her background. She was a student politics. She was in student politics, president of the Union of Students in Ireland, and has been in the NGO sector and has worked for the party as well. Really good campaigner,
Oh, I
and
did. Yes,
yeah,
I do remember meeting her. Yeah.
she seems to be making a bit of a stir in Cork South Central, and it's a tough route to a seat, but I'm hearing good things about how she's doing. And yeah, then there are a couple of others that just might surprise, but like yeah, so we have the potential gains, those ones within Dublin, and the intermingling of how the candidates perform themselves with that kind of increased profile from the European elections, and then outside of Dublin, trying to hold on to the seat in Wexford for Brendan that Brendan had held, and in those couple of extra areas where which might cause a bit of an upset. So where I grew up, west of the Shannon, I don't know if I don't know what our prognosis is like there currently. But there are there are a few potential green shoots, and like ultimately we want to increase. We need to get back up over. We need to get back into double digits again. Like it's about time. We've been on the naughty step for long enough, and and I think you you yourself referenced Ivana's kind of approach and uh, her efforts to invigorate the party. And thing is, like, her way of doing politics, it's really constructive. She's a decent person. She's not just focusing on the negatives all the time. She's always constructive. She always tries to play on the capacity for hope, and where others might play to fears and negativity. Um, there is an appeal there for her type of politics, and it's just it's a matter of getting it through. As you've seen, with a deeply fragmented system, so it's hard to cut through, and it takes time and it takes consistency and all of that. But I think she is cutting through, amongst certain proportions of the population as well. I guess the thing for afterwards as well is how we relate to the other parties in our maybe our part of the political spectrum. So particularly the Social Democrats and the Greens. We have been quite open in saying we want to have a joint platform with them after the election. We're not doing any arrangement beforehand, but if we're to go into negotiations with any of the other parties, that we do so as a collective bloc to increase our comparative strength. So I would hope that we can all be constructive on that too.
I mean, hearing that pleases me. I mean, my last question before we wrap up, what actually was going to be, you're talking about how it's so difficult in this such a fragmented political party system in Ireland. I mean, it's so similar to in Israel as well, where there is just so many different parties that it must be, and that's so foreign to us in Australia because really there is sort of 2-3 major parties that we have to deal with. But like having the Social Democrats exist, and if you're Ivana and you're trying to make a pitch to a certain type of working class and middle class voter, either in the urban areas or even some of the sort of larger regional centres, and you've got Holly Cairns and the Social Democrats, which basically is the Labor Party but a different colour, making the same pitch. It's I mean, if you're a voter, you'd be like, what is going on here?
Yeah,
And even if you just do the math, like there's 12 seats between the two of them that they currently hold. Well, sorry, 12, 13 seats that they currently hold between the two of them. And I'm wondering about what races are they going to be competing against each other,
yeah,
and in particular constituencies, which is just such a waste of resource when essentially you are the same party. And I get it; it's all like, look, I'm in the Australian Labor Party. We're factions, so we're basically the way I look at it is it's just two factions of a broader social
yeah,
democratic movement, but running a whole bunch of different races. And I just sort of see this inefficiency that's happening. So it pleases me to hear that certainly after this election, there's going to be a bit of a conversation between these two parties to start to work out ways in which we can
yeah. Well, I hope so.
work
Like
together and hopefully see some reunification again, because it just sort of, it's hard. I mean, I don't live there, but my experience when I was on the ground, the job that you guys have is hard enough as it is.
yeah,
You don't need to have splits to be only 6 seats, but then to be split when you're so small is just it doesn't make sense to me. So
yeah.
give us your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, yeah. It is a difficult one. I mentioned earlier, like, different systems reward different behavior as well, and I think our system is currently rewarding fragmentation. It, it benefits you to not have gone into government. So the Social Democrats are benefiting from that currently. Um, there's an interesting piece of polling done recently. So the way our system works, where you rank your preference of candidate, and one of the polling companies, Ireland Thinks, did a second preference poll. So they asked you to indicate who your first preference was and who you were going to transfer to from there. And the Social Democrats are ridiculously transfer friendly. They get transfers from Labour, they get transfers from the Greens, and even they do very well from the far left, and they even get some from centre right, and they're benefiting all over the system, and they've been a little bit less clear as to whether they want to go into government or not. They said they'll talk to everybody, but they're benefiting from having both ways, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. It's just the observation, But there is an okay transfer pattern between the three parties I mentioned: Labour, Social Democrats, and Greens overall. And what you will see in some of those seats that we talked about, where Labour has a chance of winning a seat, it will only be if we come top of the pile of those three, because ultimately, as they get eliminated, we will be more likely to
You'll get their
receive their
preferences.
transfers.
Yeah.
And in cases where the Social Democrats are top of that pile of three, they'll be the ones that get through, and same for the Greens. But it does, yeah, your point is very apt, that we're sometimes cancelling each other out, because you need to have enough first preferences to be in the running at all. But if we cancel each other out too early, then the system doesn't benefit you either. Now, a lot of it's about
But
relationships.
David, even from the campaigning, David, sorry to interrupt, but even from the campaigning component, like, wouldn't it be better you could say to the Social Democrats, you take Dublin Bay North, we're not going to bother there, but we'll encourage
Yeah,
our voters to vote for you guys, and we'll run dead, and vice versa. You don't run in,
yeah,
Dublin Bay South. Do you know what I mean? Like, because we don't have the money to spend resources in seats where we're competing with each other, let alone
yeah,
against the centre-right parties.
yeah. It's again, there's a systemic thing there too. You do actually benefit financially from running candidates in more more areas too, but I suppose a separate point. But yeah, but in terms of the actual political efficacy of it, yeah, absolutely. Like, a lot of it is down to relationships too. A lot of the Social Democrats are people who were formerly in the Labour Party. The person who recruited me to the Labour Party subsequently went to work for the Soc Dems. um, the the deputy leader, Cian O'Callaghan, who was standing in as leader last night in the leaders' debate, Cian was the person who nominated me as chair of my university branch, and he's a former Labour staffer and councillor. I really like him, by the way. I have a lot of time for him. But just within the context of being in government and everything, sometimes relationships deteriorate, and people feel a bit burnt and let down, or whatever the case may be. And it takes a while for that to build back up. Like, it's easy to forget politics is a very human endeavor, and people's animosities or their hurts or their concerns, they don't always go away very quickly, and it takes a while to move on from that. So I've always tried to maintain the philosophy of, those people with whom I'm friends in the Social Democrats, I don't want that to end. I'll we hang out, and we get on well, and our opinions differ, and that on certain things, and that's fine. Um, the thing is about the merger, or the perspective of a merger. There was maybe a tendency at one point when the Social Democrats started, of people saying, "Oh, it's obvious, they just need to merge." But it was sometimes people from within the Labour Party saying it, and it was almost assumed that we would subsume them, which to my mind is, it's not a helpful positioning, because it comes across to a member of Social Democrats as Labour being arrogant, or whatever the case may be. So if there is to be any kind of coming together, I think we probably need to be a bit generous about it too. And acknowledging that there will be sources of frustration on both sides, and sources of anger and upset, and do it in that spirit. But there's no indication that it's going to happen yet. Like, the kind of phrase, I can't remember what the film was. Just like, she's not that into you. Like we also can't make plans for a merger when we know they don't want it. It's not within our gift to say that. So as things currently stand, we just need to campaign on our own right, and get the greatest complement of seats we possibly can, and try and offer a strong left alternative to what's on offer at the moment, where we do double down on being decent on issues like immigration, and they have too. They've been solid, and some of them have been really strong in this. Um, so we have those shared values, and we can live with that. And I guess, drawing from historical experience, I had this conversation with a friend of mine who is in the Soc Dems. I would say the most likely place for us to have any kind of real coming together is actually if we were both in government at the same time. Because historically, the Democratic Left, a party that merged into the Labour Party in the 90s, it merged after being in government together. Where basically we were both in government with Fine Gael, and after time you kind of realize we're on the same side on almost everything. And there comes a point where you go, okay, maybe this makes sense. So I would say we're more likely to have maybe an impetus or a catalyst to do so if we were in government together. But getting us both in government together at the same time is also, not an easy thing to do because of all the hurdles to jump along the way.
I mean, that would be fascinating after the results are tallied up to see how, like, if Sinn Féin's vote has collapsed, where does that vote go? Who benefits from it? And we may be in a situation where Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael look at both Labor and the Soc Dems and say, "Hey, do you guys want to,
Yeah,
help us
they've been
form?"
making kind of noises about Labour. Both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have been making positive noises about Labour, which is it's annoyed some of us, to be honest. Um, Basically, they look like they're trying to throw the Green Party to the curb, and like even some of the kind of anonymous briefing against the Green Party in the press has been quite telling, where they've Fianna Fáilers and Fine Gaelers have been describing them like an internal opposition party in government. And like if I were a Green member, I'd take it as a compliment. But then they said they would much prefer to go into government with Labour. But no more than I described the dynamics around a prospective merger with the Soc Dems, they, they've no right to be arrogant about Labour's participation or behaviour in government either. Like we're not going in there to make up the numbers if we do go in. We will have a program of structural reform that we want, and not just throwing cash at things and pretending that that's a version of social democracy. We have things we want to achieve for our voter base and for the people more broadly. So we're not just there to make up the numbers. So they need to work on that basis too.
Well, we're going to find out in a fortnight's time. The election's on, as I said before, Friday the 29th of
Yeah,
November. We wish Ivana and the caucus and Billy, Sparks, and the whole campaign team the best of luck in the days leading up to the election, and as well as on election night. And hopefully we see some new TDs join the Labor ranks in the Oireachteas, and maybe get back in the government. Dave Kitchen, thank you so much again. Great to talk to you
you too.
today. I really do appreciate it. And maybe we'll get you back on if we get some good results after the election.
Cool. Thanks, Stephen.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.